What's the saying? Oh, well, howdy, stranger. Old Jack at your service, though the only service I've got is flapping my gums and telling how things used to be. Who am I, you ask? Well, maybe I was a gunslinger. Maybe I was the one stacking the deck. Or maybe I was just pouring whiskey for the fellas doing the dirty work. But that ain't why you're here, is it? Nah, you're here to hear a story. So lean in. Let me tell you about a town that's long gone. Coppershoe, a place where it wasn't just dust settling on the streets, but blood too. This tale starts in a town that doesn't exist on most maps anymore. Coppershoe, it was called. A dusty speck on the Texan plains, built out of greed, gunpowder, and just enough desperation to hold folks together. Back then, it was a town alive with whispered names and secrets, the kind you didn't ask too many questions about if you valued your hide. I remember it being hotter than hell the day the stranger rode in. His horse was about done for. The poor beast's ribs stuck out sharp, nostrils flaring like it had been running for 3 days straight. The stranger himself wasn't much better. He was lean, like a wolf gone too long without a hunt, with eyes that made you wonder if he was running from someone, or himself, covered in dust, his boots torn. But something in the way he carried himself said he wasn't just some drifter. No one trusted strangers in Coppershoe, and this man was no exception. The blacksmith paused mid-swing. The saloon keeper wiped his mug slower, and even kids stopped their games to stare. But he didn't pay anyone mind. He hopped off that dying horse, threw its reins around the nearest post, and walked like he already owned the place, or maybe like he had nothing left to lose. Word traveled fast in towns like that, faster than a bullet some days. By the time he walked into the saloon, a rickety thing with warped floors and a piano that couldn't hold a tune, the place was hushed. Half the folks eyed him over their whiskey glasses. That's when two types of bets started buzzing in low whispers. One, how long before he got himself stuck in trouble? And two, who'd be the first to draw? The stranger ordered whiskey. Didn't say much. Didn't look at much. Just sat at the bar and stared into his glass like it held answers. But one person in the corner wasn't impressed by the quiet act, a local rancher named Garrett Hayes. Now, Hayes wasn't just any rancher. He wasn't the type to mend fences or count calves. Hayes dealt in shadow trades, blackmail, and the kinds of business that'd leave a man staring down the wrong end of a shotgun. So when Hayes swaggered up to the stranger with his goons in tow, you could feel the room hold its breath. Hayes leaned in, grinning like a coyote. What brings a fella like you to a town like this? He'd said, voice like syrup over poison. The stranger looked up, slow. His voice was gravel. You a man who loans trouble out to strangers? Now I admit, that part stuck with me. Trouble, see, was a currency in towns like Coppershoe. A little like whiskey. Cheap at first, but cost you something fierce later. Hayes wasn't the kind of man to loan trouble without making sure you couldn't pay him back. Still, it wasn't the question itself that mattered. It was the pause that followed it, long, heavy, like the whole saloon could feel that something big, messy, and bloody had just started unwinding. They say a man's past sticks to him like dust on a hot day, no matter how far he rides, no matter how fast. And if Coppershoe was good at anything, it was sniffing out secrets. After that showdown of stares in the saloon, the stranger didn't waste words. He left his untouched whiskey on the counter, tipped his hat to no one in particular, and walked straight out. The kind of quiet confidence that makes you wonder if you're dealing with bravery or pure madness. Word spread like wildfire, as it always did. By dusk, every ranch hand, saloon regular, and car dealer was talking about him. Some said he was an outlaw, others a bounty hunter. A few whispered he used to ride with Garrett Hayes himself, and had come back to settle an old debt. The barkeep swore he caught a glimpse of scars on the man's neck, rope burns maybe. The church lady said his hands looked like a gunslinger's, scarred knuckles, steady as stone. But while the rumors were rolling, the stranger rode out to the edge of town. Not far, just to the creek running east, where the old Carter place had stood before the flames got it years back. The property was nothing now but ashes and weeds, the ghosts of a farmhouse and barn long since rotted to the ground. Yet, that's where he went. He sat out there alone as the sun dipped behind the hills, staring at that charred piece of land like it had answers. And when the moon rose, someone finally decided to pay him a visit. Garrett Hayes rode up with 3 of his men. I imagine Hayes didn't take kindly to being ignored. Power makes men greedy for acknowledgement, you see. It's not enough to have it. They need to know you see it, feel it, fear it. "You lost, Ryder?" Hayes asked, his voice lazy but sharp. This here land belonged to folks who aren't around to welcome visitors. But the stranger didn't stand, didn't twitch. He just said, "I know whose land it was." That caught Hayes off guard, just for a blink, but I saw it. Because he sure as hell knew, too. The Carter family. Word was, they'd crossed Hayes in some business nobody really wanted to understand. Then their barn burned one night. The flames jumped to the house, and no one came out. The town figured it was an accident. Everyone except the stranger staring out at the moonlit ashes. "That's so," Hayes said, leaning forward in his saddle. His grin held no humor. "Well, you keep poking around where you don't belong, friend, and you might find yourself joining them under that dirt. The thing about moments like this, lines are drawn long before the dust actually stirs. Hayes was what the West made of men like him, ruthless, powerful, feared. The stranger, he was something else entirely. I didn't know it yet, but when he stood, slow, deliberate, and met Hayes' glare in the moonlight, you could feel the shift, like thunder rumbling long before the first crack of lightning. "This place was theirs," the stranger said, his voice like gravel sharpening on steel. "Now I'm here to make sure it stays theirs. Underscore, you some kind of lawman?" Hayes sneered. "No," the stranger said, his hand brushing the worn grip of his revolver. "But that doesn't make me less dangerous." Underscore. Hayes laughed, but it wasn't the kind of laugh that reaches your gut. It was sharp, forced. The sound of a man trying to measure someone he couldn't quite figure out. Then, without another word, he yanked his horse's reins and rode back into the dark, his men scrambling after him. Underscore, the stranger stayed a while longer. Just him, the creek, the ashes, and whatever ghosts he'd come looking for. By the time he rode back into town, folks were watching from their windows, pulling the curtains just enough to peek. Me, I stayed outside the saloon, pretending like I wasn't staring. He came back to the same post, tethered that half-dead horse, and walked straight past me. But before he stepped into the shadow of the saloon's awning, he paused and said, "You know Garrett Hayes better than most, don't you?" I nodded just barely. "Then you know what happens next," he said. And with that, he walked inside. Sometimes it ain't the bullet that kills you fast, it's the truth. Cuts deep, the way words do when they're spoken like blades. And that night, the stranger decided it was time to unsheath his truth. The saloon had emptied out, except for a handful of folks too drunk or too stubborn to leave. Hayes wasn't there. He didn't drink with strangers, unless he planned to bury them. Still, the stranger walked in like he owned the place. Like he was walking into a room full of skeletons with whiskey-laced bones. I was there, perched in the corner with my own drink, watching him the way a hawk watches a mouse too bold for its own good. He didn't sit this time. He stood at the very center of the room, caught the barkeep's eye, and said louder than was polite, "You tell Garrett Hayes something for me." Not quiet, not subtle. There weren't exactly rules in Coppershoe, but there were unspoken things you didn't do if you wanted to keep breathing, and calling Hayes out publicly ranked high on that list. "Tell him this town's fences have rotted," the stranger continued, his words carrying heavier than any gunshot. "And whatever poisonous claws he's got sunk into this place, it ends now." The barkeep froze mid-polish. The other men shifted in their chairs, their eyes darting between one another like they'd suddenly all shared the same bad dream. But no one dared to answer him. Then the stranger turned to the drunk in the back, the drunk who'd spent years playing witness to Hayes' rise, Someone who'd been loyal when it suited him and quiet when it didn't. "You," the stranger said, his voice colder than the whiskey glass in the man's hand. "How far is your loyalty when you're faced with guilt greater than your coin purse?" Underscore, the drunk just stared at him, wide-eyed and lost, as the stranger took another step closer. "You won't answer, will you?" Quiet as the Carter house when it was burning to the ground. Quiet like a coward. The truth stuck to the walls of the saloon, like soot from a dead fire. No hushed whispers followed. No laughter, no shuffled cards, no clinking glasses. It was silence thick enough to choke. Then the barkeep cleared his throat, trembling so hard you could hear it. "Is all this talk about justice? Or do you just want Hayes' blood, stranger?" The stranger smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It wasn't even human. "Justice ain't clean," he said softly, "and Hayes might bleed before this town gets clean again." We waited. Everyone waited for him to crack further, for Hayes to storm in, for something that would shatter the air. "You all think Hayes is the plague of this town," the stranger continued, his voice steady as Yellowstone stone. "But he's just the infection festering because folks like you let it grow. This town sold its soul one broken fence, $1, one corpse at a time. That was the moment everything changed. The truth hit Coppershoe harder than any outlaw could have. It wasn't Hayes the stranger had come for. It wasn't even revenge. It was fire, the kind that burns down homes and the lies knotting their foundations. By the time the stranger walked back out into the night, leaving the saloon shaking on its flimsy legs, the town had already started to break. The thing about men like Garrett Hayes is they don't take kindly to being called out, especially not publicly. By dawn the next morning, the dust in town hadn't even settled from the night's whispers, but word was already spreading. Hayes had sent for the stranger. A challenge. High noon. That's how problems were solved where we came from. It didn't matter if you were clawing for justice or crippled by guilt. Gunsmoke didn't care about motives. I saw the stranger that morning, sitting outside the small inn on the quiet edge of town. He didn't touch the breakfast someone had brought him. Instead, he was sharpening a knife. Not his pistol. You'd think that'd be his focus given the day's plans. But a blade, thin and cruel as frost in the dark. He took his time with it, dragging the steel over the whetstone, his expression as still as the air before a storm. "You ready for what comes, stranger?" I hadn't planned to speak. It wasn't my business, but the words tumbled out anyhow. Maybe I just wanted to know what kind of man he really was. He didn't look up right away. The sound of the knife on stone carried a slow rhythm before he finally said, "Been ready since the day I buried my family." It felt like the town exhaled about 3 truths in that moment. Suddenly, things lined up. The way he'd gone straight to the Carter land as if it called him. How he had looked at Hayes with something more ferocious than hatred. He didn't just remember the fire that wiped him out. He'd lived it. "You Carter kin?" I finally asked. Felt it like anyone would after a punch landing square. "Maybe," he murmured, "but listen close. Don't mistake blood ties for justice. I don't ride for revenge. I ride because too many towns like Coppershoe forget there's a cost to looking the other way." High noon came slow that day, not because of the sun, but because every second felt stretched thinner than a cheap poker bluff. Hayes showed up with his usual cocksure swagger, flanked by 3 of his men, each armed heavy enough to take down a small battalion. But it wasn't numbers that had me sweating. No, sir. It was the look on Hayes' face, a sickening mix of amusement and something meaner. Like he knew this didn't feel like a fair fight, and he liked it. The stranger was already waiting in the middle of town, his shadow sharper than anyone lucky enough to have morals left. The very ground had gone dead silent, the kind of hush only seen when death was walking up. "Well now," Hayes drawled, loud enough for every window crack and alley ghost to hear. "This some kind of righteous standoff, stranger? You planning to clean house with that 6-shooter of yours?" The stranger didn't so much as twitch. "This isn't about you, Hayes," he said. "It's about everything you've done and everything this town has let you get away with." Hayes laughed, but there was no real humor in it. He gestured to the three men beside him. "See, the way we see it, this town's owed me everything it gave. I just collected my dues." He spit into the dirt. "But sure, stranger, you want to write yourself a fable about honor? Go right ahead. Just don't expect to finish it standing." Hayes started to circle slow, keeping one hand near the holstered pistol at his hip. The stranger didn't follow. He stayed still, his hand barely above a gun that looked like it had been drawn more than its fair share. "You ready to die, stranger?" Hayes sneered. The stranger's voice was low, flat. "Are you?" That's when everything froze, like the world itself stopped breathing. My eyes darted between them, wondering which would break first. Hayes had the numbers, the power, the advantage. The stranger had something else entirely. You could see it in the way he stood, like he was holding on to ghosts. When the bullets finally flew, I remember two things clear as day. First, the way Hayes fell, sprawling into the dirt in a cloud of blood and dust, as if he'd been dropped from the heavens. And second, the way the stranger turned, not to Hayes, not to the surviving goons running for the hills, but to the townsfolk, each one frozen behind windows and shadows. "One bullet won't fix this place," the stranger said, his voice cutting straight through the silence. "That takes more. Truth, backbones, plenty of grit." He stepped over the unmoving body of Garrett Hayes, holstered his gun, and just left. Didn't look back, didn't wait for thanks, didn't even reach for the men fleeing in the dust. They say when a storm passes, it leaves the air heavy, thick with the change it dragged over the land. That's what Coppershoe felt like after Hayes hit the dirt. The stranger rode out before the boy in the general store even had the guts to sweep up the blood. For the first time in years, Hayes wasn't casting his shadow over the streets. His men were gone, scattered like autumn leaves caught in a wind too strong to fight. But the stranger didn't leave behind comfort or closure. No, he left behind silence. Unspoken rules had broken, and if the town wasn't careful, it'd slip into chaos all over again. The barkeep kept his saloon shut for 3 days after it happened, as if Hayes' ghost might haunt the liquor. The ranch hands drank less. Folks stopped looking each other in the eye on the streets, like the truth hanging in the air might knock them flat. You might think the town would thank the stranger for doing what no one else dared, but no. That's the thing about justice. It doesn't come with applause. It just leaves folks aching from the weight they avoided for too long. But change ain't always loud. Sometimes it starts quiet, from folks who are tired enough, or brave enough, to take that first step. It's like the fire the stranger struck wasn't made to burn down a single man. It was meant to burn brighter, longer than even Hayes' shadow. A week after the shootout, I saw 2 ranchers arguing near the blacksmith. It wasn't about cattle or fences this time. It was about money Hayes had taken from one of their kin years back. The one still alive made the kind of demand no man in Coppershoe had dared before. You pay what you stole, or the sheriff will come knocking. I nearly spit out my tobacco laughing. The sheriff? Coppershoe hadn't seen its badge shine since Hayes bought the last one out years ago. But damned if one rancher didn't march 2 days out to a neighboring town and convince a new man to pin that star. It wasn't just the law coming back. The preacher, long feared for letting Hayes warm his pew in secret, preached about clearing sins. Children started asking questions, especially about the Carter place, the fires, and the lies their parents left behind. But don't get me wrong, not everybody wanted change. Some townsfolk clung to the last scraps of power Hayes had handed out, too scared or too greedy to let them go. One woman tried to steal land from her neighbor, claiming Hayes had given her permission before he was shot like a dog. That didn't go well for her. She ended up on trial in a neighboring county, the kind of thing folks only whispered about. Still, Coppershoe didn't survive the stranger's visit whole. Hayes wasn't the last villain to pass through, nor the only dirt kicking at the fences. But for the first time, The town stood still and faced the weight of its choices. As for the stranger, I never saw him again. Not in Coppershoe, not in the neighboring towns, and not in any paper outside Texas. I figure he rode off into another ghost town with different stories. But sometimes, in the evening, when I sit out on my stoop, I think about him, about the way his weary eyes burned like coals when he looked at Hayes, how his gun seemed to fire not just for vengeance, but for the sake of something bigger. Justice, sure. Honor, maybe. But more than anything, hope. And even though folks in Coppershoe didn't say it, I know they felt it too. They might not remember his name, but that stranger pressed a weight into this town's soul, one heavier than gunpowder, and one we'll carry for a long, long time. So, what do you make of it, friend? Did the stranger do right? Or was he just another shadow passing through? I reckon that's for you to decide. But I'll tell you something the Wild West taught me. Justice isn't always loud, and it sure as hell ain't always kind. Most times, it's quiet as the wind and sharp as the spurs on your boots. Coppershoe, it didn't exactly thrive after those days, but it learned to limp along with a bit more dignity. Folks started to believe in the idea of fairness again, even if they didn't understand the full cost of it. But you know, there's a funny thing about towns like that. They don't change quick, not fully. And the stranger? Well, if you ever find yourself riding through Texas, you won't hear much about him. His kind don't leave legacies you can trace. No statues, no ballads, no journals, just whispers. And maybe that's the way he wanted it. But me, I remember the way he didn't blink when Hayes tried to scare him. The way he stood tall, even when he knew he might not make it past noon that day. Not for glory, no. The Wild West doesn't give men like that glory. For something harder to pin down, something real. And that's why I tell stories like this, so we don't forget men like him. Not because of what he did, but because of why. So, if you're ever riding through your own Coppershoe, if you find a town that's too quiet, too broken, too full of rot, ask yourself how it got that way. Ask yourself what you'd do. Would you be the man who steps forward? The one who throws the first match? Or would you let the fire die altogether? See, the ghost of that stranger? It still lingers on the wind, waiting. The Wild West wasn't made by guns, gold, or glory. It was made by choices. And those choices, they're still out there, waiting to be made. See you around, my friend. I've got another story for you.